Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to this event. I hope it will be a very important and lively discussion. I have prepared my notes based on the first title, which was that Islam and Modernity mutually exclusive, therefore probably I will sort of present that in a certain way, maybe try and adjust it a little bit to make it more compatible with what the title has.
I have the same problem. So
Okay, well that's alright. I'll start off by saying that modernity as a phenomenon or as a concept is something that's quite complex and multi-dimensional, rather than something being quite uniformed and coherent. And similarly, Islam is also something that's quite a complex and multi-dimensional system of living, rather than being just a simple, unified, coherent way. And I think it's with that that you will get the initial answer to the question, because by having these two very complex concepts, ideologies or systems, that no doubt there's going to be differences in how their outlook and their worldview. In a similar way, modernity is probably seen as more of as a reaction that's happened to certain events, due to certain realities that were happening, especially in the Western world, and probably more so towards the 18th century. And it's that kind of reaction that has given that process, that birth of the concepts of modernity, which has continued to develop. And because it is a reaction, it probably is influenced by the reasons for which it reacted to. I would probably assert that was in the main a reaction to the church and how the church was viewed and how the church behaved in Europe. And obviously church being one of the most important symbols of religion in the world at that time and still today, it had that importance element of, it was a reaction to faith, reaction to religion and what religion stood for. And then you have Islam, which is also a religion, it's also a way of life, it's also a system. And then there is where you get this potential overlap. Does modernity in its reaction therefore extend to all religion? Is modernity about rejection of traditions? Is modernity about concepts of advancing reason and reason only? Is it about pushing science, whatever we understand science to be, because even that has different dimensions. So in that regards, the question about Islam and modernity has to be really looked at in terms of the actual principles that come with that. Because on the one hand, Islam is a religion that was born 1400 years ago, but the very essence of how Islam was put together as a religion, the elements that make up Islam, actually are not things which are static, but rather there are elements within Islam which make it a dynamic religion, elements of Islam which encouraged rational thinking, encouraged using reason, but with the added, I would say, advantageous point that it also took into consideration not only just reason, but also revelation. And it was to look at the worldview rather than from just the perspective of trying to give material and things which are sensed and can be felt, and just to consider concepts from that perspective, but rather give more wider view, almost having like the teleological aspect of everything having an aim, having a purpose in life, which one may argue that modernity doesn't really consider. The other aspect is that Islam is also driven on aspects which are based on values. And because values are the essence of what makes a human the social animal that he or she is. Whereas modernity might be just dealing with the actual world that a person lives in. We also would see that in many ways modernity is centered. The vantage point of modernity is around man, whereas in religion and Islam it's centered around God. And even though both of them serve the interest of man, but that center in itself means that there is altogether a different core to how they would build their the regulations and the laws and so on, the foundations that come out of it. But Islam has a very important concept, which is this concept of ijtihad, this concept of legal reasoning, this concept of looking at and sensing the aspects of the world and building on it. And that's what made Islam a religion which has survived and continues to survive, because it's not static for just a period of time. The new developments that happen have extensions within principles, because even though society changes, there are laws in society which don't change. Nobody's going to just abandon the law of gravity, for example, or the laws of dynamics or whatever, just because time manages to evolve. There are certain things which will remain constant. And it is from that perspective that rejecting tradition outright is something that Islam does not accept, but rather accepting tradition, but building on tradition, building on the foundations, and using reason and using the scope of how the world has changed to allow things to adapt and allow laws to develop based on these changes. Also, we see that, or maybe also can be asserted, that modernity was born out of a reaction to the church, which also was in the main against science. It was at war with scientists. It was treating scientists as heretics. And therefore there was a need to break away from that kind of still and that kind of very limited and very obtuse way of looking at things, and there was a need therefore to come up with the concepts and the phenomena, allow that process to develop away from this very closed mentality. Whereas with Islam, in the very early stages of Islam, science was embraced to a very large state, to the extent that the political entities that ruled the Muslim world not only embraced science, but they pushed towards science. And therefore you have the House of Wisdom as established by Al-Maymun, and how he pushed for scientific works and works which were written in India and Persia and in Greece, were all translated in an effort to push that scientific drive there. So if Islam from the beginning was already embracing that science, there wasn't really a need for a reaction against Islam, because that came inherently with the very principles that science was, which was encouraged by Islam. And I want to just end with this last point. Yes, time keeping up with the times can be one of two ways. It can mean progress, or it might mean going astray, because just keeping up with times is not a default position that things are developing towards betterness or betterment. And we can see in society today, as we have different laws, there's very much a trial and error. Sometimes laws come into position and they're tried, or society is going in a certain direction. If we don't have the benefit of being able to look at the overall realities of what is being achieved by these changes, and that sometimes isn't something that can be looked over in decades, but rather needs centuries and maybe even more, to see what are the effects of these changes on our society. So even though modernity gives that impression of change and development and being modern, that in itself isn't conducive fully to progress. And in fact, with Islam there is a very important inherent nature which I mentioned before, which is that looking at reason but also taking the values aspect. And I think in today's society it's very important that any aspect, any quality inherent in the human which allows him or her not only to progress in terms of the way that they're thinking, but also provides a driving force for how they behave in society. If that driving force was geared up properly, then faith, religion, would not only be something which is appreciated and positive, but very much needed in society, because through that very essence of having values accompanied with reason, we'd be able to have a society which develops, but also a society that looks far beyond the realm of just material, rather beyond looking at, transcending beyond material and looking at how, as a society, we can work together to achieve bigger aims and bigger values.